drop a like and do share. Leave your comments and do not forget to subscribe for more videos.
Welcome to Edupedia World Grade 10 Computer Science Video Lecture Series. I am Upeka Vendibona, and from this episode we are going to discuss about arrays in C++. So what is an array? How do we define an array? How do we use an array? An array is a sequence of variables that shares the same name and that is referenced using an index. In technical words, we can define array as a homogeneous sequence of objects allocated in contiguous memory. That is, all the elements of an array have the same type and there are no gaps between the objects of the sequence. Arrays allows you to store a large number of values of the same type and that are related in some way. For example, consider Height's list of students in a class. So all the values in this list represent a height value. So they are all in the same type. And another thing about arrays is arrays can be multidimensional. For example, arrays can not only just store the height values of just a single class, but on the whole grade. Height list of classroom A students and height list of classroom B students and so on. So in this lesson, we are going to learn how to define one-dimensional arrays and how to define two-dimensional arrays. Now here is how we define and initialize an array. For an example, float is the data type of the array and float array is the name of the array, and inside the square brackets we define the length of the array. So when we say float array and within the square bracket 0, the length is 0. And when we say float array 1, the length is 1. And when we say float array 2, the length is 2. So in a declaration, an array is indicated by a square bracket. Whatever the number you put inside in the square brackets, the array keep that amount of spaces for the array. A local variable does not start life with a valid value, not even with the value 0. Said in another way, a local variable contains garbage until you actually store something in it. Locally declared arrays are the same. Each element contains garbage until you actually assign something to it. You should initialize local variables when you declare them. This rule is even truer for arrays. If it is a small array, you can initialize the array at the same time it is declared, like as you see in these three code lines. If we take the first example, that float array got the values 0.0, 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 and 4.0. So it has 5 elements. The element of an array are numbered from 0 upwards. So the 0th element in the first code line is 0.0. We called it index 0. The index 1 element is 1.0. The index 2 element is 2.0. And index 3 element is 3.0. And the index 4, the last element, is 4.0. All the values we initialize for this array are comma separated. Now in here, if we try to add another value for this array, you will get an exception, because when we declare the array, we define the length of this array is 5. So currently we have got 5 values. If it becomes 6, you will get an exception. There are actually multiple ways to declare and initialize arrays. If we define the length of the array at the declaration, then it is not necessary to initialize the values at the same time. In a later part of the program, before using the array, you can assign the values for each index of the array, like this. So from the first code line, we assign the value 0.0 in the 0th index position. And then we assign the 1.0 value for the index position 1. And then we assign the value 2.0 in the index position 2. Now remember, if you try to do something like this, assigning values for the index position 5, 6 or something more than that, you will get an exception. Because as we define the length of this array is 5, we cannot have the index position 5 and more than that. Okay, now if we are not mentioning the length of the array at the declaration, then it is necessary to initialize the values at the same time within the curly braces and values as comma separated. The array automatically takes the length as how many values that you have initialized. So the second code line depicts something like that. Even though we have not mentioned the length of the array, this code line is identical to the first code line. The third code line shows another thing that you could do with arrays. If you want to initialize all the elements in an array to a common value, then you could do it by mentioning only that value. So in that code line, it initializes all the 25 locations in the float array to 1.0. Now the problem of the array is you cannot change the length of the array in the later part of the program. If the length is 5, it is always 5. That is because the number of elements of a named array must be known at the compile time. When it knows the length of the array at the compile time, it can arrange the memory locations, that number of memory locations specifically for that array. Okay, now we know multiple ways of how to declare and initialize arrays. Therefore, now let's move on to the discussion of arrays of arrays, which means multidimensional arrays. Actually, the scope of this course is about two-dimensional arrays. Arrays are adept at storing sequence of numbers. Some applications require sequences of sequences. A classic example of this matrix configuration is the spreadsheet. Laid out like a chessboard, each element in the spreadsheet has both an x and y offset. Now look at the code line at the bottom. Int is the data type, int matrix is the name of the array, and this time we got two square brackets. It means the array is two-dimensional. This matrix is 10 elements in one dimension and 5 in another for a total of 50 elements. In other words, int matrix is a 10-element array, each element of which is a 5-int array. As you might expect, one corner of the matrix is in int matrix 0, 0, while the other corner is int matrix 9, 4. Now to initialize that kind of a two-dimensional array, you could do something like this. The data type of this array is int, the name of this array is int matrix. It's a 2-element array and each element is 3-int array. The 0th index position got 3-element array with the values 1, 2, 3, and the index position 1 got a 3-element array with the values 4, 5, 6. Each set of values is within the curly braces. Okay, now take a look at the code segment shown in here. In the first code line, it defines a int type constant variable max with the initial value 100. In the second code line, it defines a int type array with the length as the value of the variable max, which means 100. So it's a global array of 100 integer elements. And then we get a function which takes a int type argument. Inside this function, the first code line defines an array with the char data type and the length is 20. So it's a local array and lives until the end of the scope, which means it can act within the function. The next code line is another array with the int data type and the length is 60. So it is also a local array. Now the third code line, it's an array with the double data type, and this time the length is defined with the variable n, which means the argument that function takes. Now could you remember, previously I told you the number of elements of a named array must be known at the compile time. So due to that reason, you cannot do something like the third code line. As array size not a constant value, you will get an exception. The elements of an array are of any type. Arrays of floats, doubles and longs are all possible. However, arrays of characters have particular significance. Human words and sentences can be expressed as an array of characters. An array of characters containing my first name would appear like this. So in this array, the data type is char, the name of this array is smyname, and this is a one-dimension array. Now tell me, what is the length of this array and what is the last index position of this array? Yes, the length of this array is 6 and the last index position is 5. The index position 0 got the character value uppercase U, the index position 1 got the value lowercase p, the index position 2 got the character value lowercase e, the index position 3 got the character value lowercase k, the index position 4 got the character value lowercase h, and the index position 5, the last index position, got the value lowercase a. Now, rather than initializing character by character as we previously did, an array of chars can be initialized with a string literal. Take a look at this code line. Here I initialize the whole string without the curly braces. Now there is a problem with this method. If we count the characters, it has 6 characters, but the length of this array would be 7. That is because the compiler adds a terminating 0 at the end of a string literal. A 0 terminated string is the norm in C and many systems. We call such a 0 terminated array of characters a C-style string. All string literals are C-style strings. Now note that the char with the numeric value 0 is not the character 0. The purpose of that terminating 0 is to allow functions to find the end of the string. Now if I note it down, only character arrays can be initialized by string literals, but all the arrays can be initialized by a list of values of their element type. For example, take a look at the 4 code lines. In the first code line, it's an array of 6 ints. Note that the number of elements of the array AI is 6 and nothing else. The second code line, the last 90 elements are initialized to the value 0. That is because the first 10 values are mentioned in the initializer list, but not the last 90 elements. Therefore, for the last 90 elements, it will get the default value 0. In the third code line, all the elements are initialized to the value 0.0. That is because it has only the curly braces without values. Therefore, it would get the default value 0.0. In the fourth code line, it's a character array. In this method of initialization, it does not add a 0 at the end. Adding a 0 at the end rule is for literal character strings only. Okay, now I'll mention again the rules that we have learned so far about declaring and initializing arrays. If an array isn't given a size, the size is deduced from the initializer list, as in here the first code line and the fourth code line. Both of them haven't got any value inside the square brackets, but with the initializer list we can say the number of elements of AI is 6 and the number of elements for char is 3. If there are fewer initializer values than array elements, as in the definitions of AI2 and AD, the remaining elements are initialized by the elements type's default value. So for the ints it is 0 and for the double it is 0.0. Okay, now we are talking about how to access an array value. If you want to access an array value in a certain index position, you can mention that index position inside in a square bracket with the name of the array. So in this code line, we are going to print out the value in the third index position. The value of the third index position is 3.0. So at the console, you will get 3.0 printed out. So likewise, you can obtain the values of the 0th index position to the 4th index position. If you want each value in the array one by one, then you can loop through the array. So here I am going to use a for loop to do that. If you got an array with a terminating value 0, then you can use the for loop in this way. So in the middle parameter, you can use string array and the variable I inside the square brackets. In this way, you can loop through all the characters in the array and end at the 0 terminating value. Now, why it's ended there? Remember, this middle parameter should be a boolean value, either true or false. The 0 is the only numeric value that converts to false. All the other values translates to true. So this means you can write a for loop to iterate through the string literal characters. But you cannot use this approach to iterate through arrays with other data types. That is because they doesn't have the 0 terminating value. If you want to loop through them, then you have to use the length of the array in the middle parameter. So in the second for loop, you can see the middle parameter says I lesser than 5, the length of the array. So it will loop when I is 0, as the initial value of the variable I is 0, and it will loop when I is 1, when I is 2, when I is 3, when I is 4, and not when I is 5. If we want to access a value in a certain index position of the array, you can use this variable I. So like as we learned in the previous slide, you can mention the variable I inside the square brackets rather than mentioning a specific number. So you have to put that code line inside the for loop. And with that, we are going to end up this episode. From this episode, we have learned how to write an array, the declaration part and the initialization part. From the next episode, we are going to build up a practical application called palindrome from the things that we have learned so far. So thank you for watching and stay tuned on with Edupedia World.